Hello, I'm Jack Rasmussen, Director and Curator of the American University Museum at the Katzen Arts Center in Washington, D.C. I'm here to welcome you to this virtual discussion of our current exhibition, Amber Robles-Gordon's Successions, Traversing U.S. Colonialism, curated by Larry Osei-Mensah. The exhibition is on view now through December 12th. We're open to the public without appointment on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, but not over the Thanksgiving weekend. I hope you'll be able to come down and see this exhibition for yourself in person. This program is done in collaboration with Millennium Arts Salon. Entering its 22nd year, Millennium Arts Salon is committed to advancing cultural literacy through the arts. It does this principally through salon talks, print projects, and national and international tours, and through partnering with arts organizations. Amber will be joined by Dr. Tuliza Fleming. Juanita Harding, one of the founding directors at Millennium Arts Salon, will be making the introductions. Juanita, it's a pleasure at long last to be collaborating with you and Millennium Arts Salon.
Thank you so much, Jack. I too am excited about this collaboration. It's a delight to be here with all of you today. I want to thank everybody that joined us today on a Saturday afternoon. And I'm so excited about the conversation that's getting ready to happen between these two really young and energetic and brilliant women in their field, in their respective fields. So I'll jump right in to introduce them. But again, just express my excitement and my delight to be working with the Katzen, the American University Museum at the Katzen. You guys do extraordinary work, and it's a pleasure, and it's so delightful to see Amber Robles-Gordon work hanging in that beautiful space. So with that, let me introduce Amber. Amber is a mixed media artist of West Indian heritage, is the way she frames it. She's known for doing commissioned work, both temporary work and permanent public art installations. You may remember one of her public art pieces hanging on the hotel owned by the rebels during the era that we were doing art fairs here in DC in that space. She has over 20 years of experience exhibiting and in art education. She has been commissioned to do critiques, to do lectures, and exhibitions. She has an interesting blend of business and art in her background, which I find quite refreshing. She received a BS in Business and Administration from Trinity University and an MFA in print painting from Howard University. So her passion is art, but she also brings a business sensibility to it. She's been exhibited nationally and internationally in some exotic places: Germany, Italy, Malaysia, England, and Spain. And she has participated in residencies in Costa Rica and in Italy, in Rome, Italy. So quite a breadth of experience as an artist. Her work has been reviewed and featured in magazines and journals, newspapers, and online. And she just recently has an online solo exhibition at the Gallery d'Art Universidad del Sagrado Corazon, I'm sure I'm butchering it, but in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And she was featured at the Tafita Gallery in the 154 Contemporary African Art Fair in London, and many other places as well. And now she's at the Katzen, and we're going to hear her talk about her exhibition in conversation with another brilliant person in her field, Miss Tuliza Fleming, Dr. Tuliza Fleming. She was the Interim Chief Curator of Visual Arts at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. During her tenure at the museum, she's played a critical role in leading the museum's art collection. She served as lead curator on several exhibitions with lengthy names, too long to call out in total here, but Reckoning, Protest, Defiance, and Resilience in 2021, an inaugural exhibition, Visual Art and the American Experience in 2016. She also curated Clementine Hunter in 2018 and co-curated Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing about the Apollo Theater in 2010 with a beautiful catalog. Prior to her current position, she was the Associate Curator of American Art at the Dayton Art Institute, where my husband Mel and I were actually introduced to her. We were actually, not to her personally, but to her work as a curator at that museum. And she's organized exhibitions at the Dayton Art Institute as well. For example, The Glass of Louis Comfort Tiffany and Monet and the Age of American Impressionism. So her breadth is quite wide. Dr. Fleming received her MA and her PhD from the University of Maryland. And she's written, as I mentioned, many publications with lengthy names, too long to lay out here. But she is really a giant in her field, highly regarded, and we're excited to have her in conversation with Amber, these two very significant figures in the Washington art scene. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the two of them to begin the conversation. Enjoy, everyone, and thank you again.
We're going to start with a slideshow to give people an example of what she's doing at American University, this exhibition, this fabulous exhibition, which I encourage you to go to. So we're going to look at a number of pictures first and then get back into the conversation. Okay, I think that's it. If everybody can mute their microphones, that would be great. And I just wanted to start off, Amber, and it's so good to have a conversation with you. I really enjoyed seeing your exhibition and hearing what you had to say about your artworks. And I'd like to start the conversation by asking you about your journey in terms of deciding to become an artist. I thought it was really interesting that you had your bachelor's degree in business. So I was wondering what drew you to the art world and participating as a visual artist?
So in my experience, I knew I wanted to be an artist since I was 8. And because I knew that at an early age, like for example, I I tell people that I used to carry a Franklin Covey, and this is going to date myself, but it's okay. But a Franklin Covey, for those that don't remember, is one of those agendas. It's like a serious way of organizing and putting tasks together and creating goals. And I had one since I was 16. And so I had like 5-year, 10-year, and 15-year goals. And they were all oriented around being an artist to a certain degree. And I was very fortunate to have a mother that nurtured my spirit in that way. She saw it early, and she saw how I responded to art, taking me to various exhibitions and cultural events. And it just became very clear to me that that's what I wanted to do.
So can you tell me a little bit about your experience at Howard and how that shaped what you're doing now?
Absolutely. So I actually applied to Howard with some of my what I would now call it old school collages, and or what's called paper mosaic, where you're tearing and ripping paper, magazine paper, in order to form either a concept, an abstract concept, or a figuration. And I was doing that and a little bit of figuration prior to, but Howard and Black Artists of DC impacted my work in so many ways. One of the main ways was that it helped me get out of two-dimensional works, and helped me merge in fabric into my work. What else? And beyond that, you know, I always talk about the whole dual MFA program. Like, I was in Howard's MFA program, but along with my association and some of the partnerships that I made along with Black Artists of DC, I felt like I was in a dual program. So to me, it was like this living, breathing experience that was beyond an MFA program,
Mhm.
but also being a part of an organization that had such a range of artists and or curators coming in at their different viewpoints, and it absolutely influenced where I am today, and I'm grateful for it, actually.
Well, thank you. That's really wonderful. Howard does really wonderful things historically and as we speak right now. The last time we talked a little bit about how you identify as a person and as an artist. And you have Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, African-American. These words are part of your identity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how these various identities that you have in terms of your background has really shaped who you are and where you're going in your career.
Yeah, so my family is from the Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rico, St. Thomas, St. John, Angola.
Can we have Camila? I'm sorry, but Camila, can you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. I'm sorry.
So, and Spanish was my first language. My mother was raised a good portion of her childhood. She was raised in Puerto Rico. And although I am unfortunately not connected with my Puerto Rican side of my family, or those that actually reside in PR, you know, I've always been, my mom made it a point to have other either Latinas and or she was working throughout Spanish-speaking organizations for a good portion of my childhood, up until maybe I was about 13 or 14. So I always had the full gamut of what an Afro-Latina could be around me and influencing my up into my teens. And so that's something that I will never forget. But also my Afro-Latinidad or that part of me it's growing, it's morphing. It's one of the things, because I was not able to, because I was raised here and did not have that influx of or surge in that aspect of my culture throughout my early on life. It's something that I've been trying to figure out how to, through these works, how to manifest that for my continued life. And that's part of the reason why I created the works.
Can you talk about a little bit about your process of getting back to your roots? I understand that this was a journey for you. It wasn't something that you had done previously due to being raised in this country, but can you talk a little bit about your journey in terms of going back to Puerto Rico and really reclaiming your roots?
Yeah, so when it comes to this body of work, part of it was that I was literally going back and trying to heal my 5-year-old self, because as a 5-year-old, I was raised in Arlington, Virginia, and Spanish was my first language, but I was teased tremendously, so much so that I came home one day to my mother and basically decided that I didn't want to speak Spanish anymore. And so that absolutely, unfortunately, influenced who I am in one way or another. But as an adult, I decided that I wanted to go back before 30. It didn't happen before 30, but that was part of my one of my personal goals, is to then go back and be able to create art in Puerto Rico, be able to live there for an extended period of time, and be able to build a level of community, and my chance to also reconnect with some of my family. So through that goal is how I ended up starting the series, the initial series that prior to the actual Quilts, which is Place of Breath and Birth. You got to forgive me. I've been doing so many tours, I'm starting to lose my voice, but that's how that begun for me, through the Place of Breath and Birth series.
So tell me a little bit about your recent, and I don't know how recent this is, but within the show, your exploration of imperialism, American imperialism and colonialism, particularly in your quilt series. Can you talk a little bit more about why this was so important for you to focus on in this particular series of works?
Yeah, Ali, can we advance through the images a couple so I can see if we have a picture of DC political? Keep on going. There, can you stop that one? Thank you. All right, so as I was saying, you know, the journey to 5-year-old self to healing. One of the things as I was researching about the first series was about how Puerto Ricans were treated throughout by the U.S. government, and the various ways that is done so. And as I was researching, I basically realized that yes, Puerto Ricans are treated unfairly when it comes to the fact that they speak other language, literally the range of the color of their skin, and the almost like the guessing of how they would politically show up if they all had the right to vote. Once I realized that it was not just Puerto Ricans, it was also the territories, people of the U.S. territories, where you still have the issue, not the issue, but it's that we're referring to people of color or people that are not white or not of European descent. And the assumption is that if they were to have congressional power, that they would not in turn vote and or support things that were under literally the Republican mantra. And so that is what made me decide to make the quilts represent, and there's 6 in total. The 6th one is representing my own energy. But that's what made me decide to make the quilts represent each of the US inhabited territories.
So can you talk a little bit about the piece that we are looking at right now? I think that when it comes to the subjects of imperialism, colonialism, people don't always think about Washington, D.C.
No, they do not.
Part of that disenfranchised territory. So I really found this piece really very interesting and very poignant and very on time. And I was wondering, can you talk about your experience in living in DC and what brought you to create this really wonderful piece?
Yeah. So, like you said, I was raised in Arlington, but I've lived in DC for the last 20 something years. And so my access to, or my introduction to politics and even my own strain of patriotism happened through, Arlington County, but also while living in the district. And I remember the slow increments of how the change in how I was seeing and perceiving politics in the district. For something as simple as during high school, I remember being drawn to things like the Emmys or some of those the shows that are talking about who's of value, basically, whose work do we value? And it wasn't, and I'm using that as a very simplistic, in my opinion, very simplistic example, but it'll make sense in a minute. It wasn't until I started to realize that the people that looked like me, sounded like me, and or that were of color like me were not being rewarded for their value, for their contributions. And that's when I decided to kind of get rid of those type of what I would consider almost frivolous things, because they weren't for me, meaning that the audience that was giving these rewards and awards and things like that, they were not looking at people of color in that way. So this was like my little entry to it, but it helped to broaden the gamut of what I was looking for in general. And it absolutely involved politics, and it changed the way, for example, I remember feeling like some of the first times I saw Ronald Reagan, and having a sense of hearing some of the speeches throughout the years of different presidents or people that were running for presidency. And then as you slowly begin to realize that they are still not talking about you, it changes their perception and the way that you evaluate what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and specifically in the media. So all that to say, coming back, I come to this work with a very, very, I guess, distinct perspective. I'm definitely an Afro-Latina. But in the Arlington County school system, I was a Black girl, and God knows there's nothing wrong with that perspective, but there's nothing wrong with being a Black girl, but that perspective is limiting change as it relates to who I am. But it also gave me a very specific insight into this work. So this particular image, the composition is definitely compositionally different than the others, because I wanted to orient it by showing how map-wise how the DC is represented, but also within it, when I was tacking the political sides of each quilt, because each quilt is double-sided. The front of the quilt is the political side, the back of the quilt is the spiritual side. And what I decided is to dissect either the territory's seal or their flag. And in this one, I dissected the seal, and it actually had a whole lot of figuration, which I didn't really want to deal with, but it had to be done. But you can see it, but there's a layer of what I would call representation of beaded representation of the indigenous tribes within the district, or were in the district. On top of that is imagery that speaks to the atrocities that has happened throughout slavery. And then on top of that is the broken down portions of how I dissected the actual seal. And the seal includes Lady Liberty. It includes a reference to justice through the eagle, and Lincoln. And then along, tilted Lincoln to the left, to the side. And then there's an array of texts that's underneath the text of the seal that says the District of Columbia. And the text is speaking to various aspects of either how the US has, in my opinion, failed the indigenous people, of Native Americans of the District of Columbia, and in general of the United States, but also it's intertwined with how it has failed people of African descent within the United States. Because for me, this was not a conversation about the individuality of each, whether it be each territory or each grouping within the territory. For me, the quilts are a conversation about who is the greater people of the greater majority, and what that means for me is people that are not Black. I'm sorry, people that are not European descent, or people that are not white, because when it comes to people of the greater majority, that majority is people of color. It's not people that are white, and that is who I'm trying to some degree, that is who I'm trying to not cultivate, but speak to and encourage to find more ways, better ways, more inclusive ways of addressing, talking to each other, finding common ground, and figuring out how to move forward.
That's lovely. I wanted to ask you about using textiles in your work. I think most people would know you as partially a textile artist, although not completely. But can you
Yeah.
talk about what drew you to textiles and how your work has evolved using that medium?
Yeah, so I just like I've known really early that I want to be an artist, I've also always been interested in textile. Specifically, my mom made it a point, quilts were one of her loves. And I remember we had works, not the actual original works of Barbacoa, but posters of Barbacoa in my home. But also throughout the Latin America, there are indigenous quilted like story quilts, and that's probably not the technical term for it, but they were story quilts. And my mom had versions of those throughout our home. Um, Textile was always something, and creating in general was always something that was part of our aesthetic at home, but also part of our family aesthetic. I literally, we used to make Christmas ornaments with ribbons and or sewing. So that element, that reaching into what I would consider like a collective history or collective culture, was always like given a certain amount of importance, and part of how my mother taught us to engage each other.
Mhm. So,
I didn't get your whole question. Just remind me of the question again, because
okay,
sometimes I get carried away in my answers.
no, I was just asking, and you did answer the question,
Okay.
this journey into using textiles and what influenced you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, when did you start working with quilts? Is this the first time you actually started working with actual quilts, or have you sort of done this before in your career?
No, I have not done this before. And I will say that, before, this is one of the things I did concretely know, was that I wanted to do the work for the AU show on quilts. I thought that I was going to be having a discussion, like a call and response with Robert Rauschenberg's works, his bed series.
Mhm.
But because of COVID and because, global pandemic, the show morphed within 2 years. So what I originally thought I was going to be creating the quilts about absolutely morphed because of the experiences that I ended up having in Puerto Rico while I was there. But I initially thought that I was going to be almost doing a response to his work. But the other aspect of why I use quilts or textile is because I really believe that the fabric is like our second skin. We literally do not leave home without fabric. We adorn ourselves with it. We cover ourselves with it. We literally sleep on it. We wake up to it. And if in relation to psychology, fabric is how we have an emotional connection to fabric. And beyond that, I love what I consider to innovate. I've always been intrigued by using materials that we have one intention for, and then creating, manipulating it to appear and represent some other form of narrative, and raise it to the level of fine art. That has always excited me.
Can we move to one of the backs of the quilts, Alexandra? Can we move to an image of that? Because I really want to talk about two things. The issue, we can go back one slide.
Mhm.
The issue of spirituality as part of, it's like this duality that you're doing with these quilts. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and why you chose to do pure abstraction with the back of these quilts.
Okay. All right, so you are looking at a studio picture of me working on, the image on the left is the spiritual side of USVI, which USVI is St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. And then on the right is the spiritual side of the DC quilt, which the name of that one is Welcome to the District of Columbia. So when I was working on the political side of the quilts, I realized, and remember I pointed out earlier that I was dissecting either the flag or their seal. And so those sides are like my opinion, my reflection or critique of the US's political involvement in the territories. And at that point, I didn't realize, or I thought I was only going to be representing that point of view. But once I was halfway through both of the political sides, I realized that I did not want to only leave my viewer and or myself with just this opinion of the territories, and specifically not the territories, but the U.S. involvement in the territories. At that point, I decided that if I did that, that would mean that I was in some ways only accessing the territories for a political and or critique or for one specific, not necessarily positive gain. And I didn't want to leave the viewer and or my spirit couldn't allow that. I wanted to give each of the quilts, each of the territories a full dynamic. I wanted to make them as whole as possible, this representation of them as whole as possible. So that meant that I had to give them a spiritual side. And that's when I went back to both the curators, Larry Osa Mensa and Jack, and said that I need to be able to make these works double-sided. I need to make them whole, my representation of them whole. And I wanted people, the other reason why I hung them from the ceiling in that large oval space was because I wanted you to have to confront them. I wanted you to have to walk up to them and see them almost eclipse you. And they really do that. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the central image on the spiritual side of the quilts. You talk about the significance of the rubber tree that shows up in your work, both your two-dimensional and I guess one would call it three-dimensional quilts, in terms of being able to see both sides and walk around. Can you tell me a little bit about why this particular aspect of nature and this tree really shows up over and over and over again in your work?
Yeah, so part of the experience when I went to Puerto Rico was going to see the Universidad del Sagrado de Corazón, which is a sacred university. And I was going there for the Place of Breath and Birth was going to be exhibited there as a solo exhibition in their campus gallery. And one of the first experiences on the campus was I encountered a banyan tree or a rubber tree. And that tree to me was absolutely so gorgeous. You don't always get to see the root, the trunk itself, but you get to see these roots that are like literally roots coming from the ground, and they form this really thick and beautiful trunk, and it goes up. And then the roots then come down, expand down, and sometimes they hang. And it's a banyan tree, so which means that other organisms or greenery attach themselves to it and grow from it. And to me, it was like a manifestation of like even the African diaspora and how it's then rooted and planted, instrumental for so many different aspects of diasporic culture. And so what I realized, one of the promises I made to myself while I was in PR was to do sketching, and to sketch every day for maybe about 30 minutes to an hour. And in doing so, my sketches ended up, I realized probably about the third or fourth day in of the sketching, was that they were a geometric breaking down or abstraction of the banyan tree. And so there, through all of the works, an abstracted form or iteration of the banyan tree starts at the bottom, comes up, all the way through the middle of the work, and then sprouts out at the top. And that was one of the core, the connective tissues that I found between both works, and it was essential. Now, in the quilts, it's also how I am using the spiritual side to talk about the people's connection to earth, people's connection to atoms and space, and or even string theory I was thinking about when I was creating these works. And it also helped me give them a skeletal form, like to further give them the sense of being three-dimensional and being an actual being.
So let's look at one of the collages. Alexandra, if you could pull that up. Tell me a little bit about your process of creating these collages and how it's similar and also how it's different from what you're doing with the quilts.
Yeah. So the collages are absolutely they're on canvas. And there's 10 of them. And originally my goal was to create all the works in Puerto Rico, but that didn't happen because the pandemic hit and we had to leave PR. But each of the quilts were actually each of the collages were actually started in Puerto Rico. And a portion of it there's a mint green background that comes out in every work. And on this work, you can only see it on the bottom tier. But so there's a layer of paint, but the rest of it is layers of magazine paper and building up collage. And also connective tissue. So each one has, like I mentioned before, the banyan tree or a version of the banyan tree, and or it's connected through circles. You know, and if you study circles and how they are represented within our world, you know, some of it is connecting to feminine energy, womanhood, but also it's about casting spells, saying prayers. When you do research about mysticism or how nature-based energy is crafted or spawned to existence, it's done in circles. So whenever I'm working on something that I'm very intently to say something or to kind of convene a conversation about a concern, I do it through circles.
So I think that the last time we spoke or I've seen you, you were talking about these various sort of horizon lines, how you're dividing up your picture plane. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means? Because it does show up in a lot of your collages. So I'm really interested in understanding why you did it and what you hope to impart.
Yeah. Okay, Ali, can you find one of the other images of the collages? Can you just advance one more? Okay, this one shows it kind of. Okay, so one of the things that the other influences, the connective tissues that came about in the works was because of where we were living and where my studio was in Puerto Rico. We chose a structure that was three levels up. One, to get away from the mosquitoes, two, to get away from any, you know, the islands have a lot of issues with mold or building up of water, the accumulation of it, and I have allergies. So the view that I was able to see was like 3 to 4 miles out from in my studio. And you know, I was able to take in the transition from night to day or day to night in various ways throughout my time there. And literally able to take in like the textures of Puerto Rico, you know, from the abandoned homes, from the beautiful structures and our homes, to, you know, the many populace of dogs and cats. You know, it's all part of, and even, you know, chickens and roosters. It's all part of Caribbean texture and density. And what I decided when I was creating the works and playing against, you know, giving an atmospheric perspective in general, but also, oh Lord, I forgot the third thing, but it was absolutely important that I show that each of the works in some shape or form reflects the transition of day to night and night to day. So the third connective tissue was using Afrofuturism in the works. And I've always, to some extent, even before I could reference it as Afrofuturism, I would always create something, either putting people of color in places and things that I wanted to see us in. Like, for example, I've always been drawn to fantasy or sci-fi and wondered why there wasn't enough of us in it, you know, and I absolutely know that we are the part of the future. So I sometimes I create situations and places and specifically landscapes make sure that I am projecting either what I want to see, feel, or create.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Can you talk about how your stay in Puerto Rico really prompted you to create art that is, I think, in some ways similar to the art that you were creating before, but in some ways really different?
Yeah.
And if you can sort of talk about how, things that you carried over from your past work and things that have emerged with this current series, and how and what you want to impart to your viewer when you create these new works.
That's a loaded question, Ms. Tuliza. Good one though. So connections, I love, one of the things I love about creating in working in series is that I've been able to the connective tissues that I reference, I think that they are throughout my work. My work is always about some type of relationship to womanhood and patriarchy, and how we as women and people of color navigate it. And even if it's the underpinnings of it, like for example, some of my largest sculptures or public artwork that are chicken wire based, people see them as, and then through the chicken wire, it's colors and fabric woven through it. People see it only for mostly for its aesthetic value, but my my narrative underneath that is that that wire, that formation, that base material is usually some type of hard form material that is either used to build or to constrict. So to me, that's representing masculine energy and somewhat our patriarchal society, and what I'm then either sewing, weaving, or adhering through and under, and henceforth through the base structure that talks about energy that usually feminine energy, but energy that transforms restrictions and boundaries. So I think that hopefully will always be a part of all of the work that I create, even if not everybody gets that. But I absolutely think one of the things I strive for in my work is to work through my own strife, things that are, tapping at the base of my brain and saying, why is the world like this? Either for myself, and then I try and make it so that it's also a conversation that anybody can access at any point, meaning that, because if I'm struggling through this, then someone else has to be throughout other aspects and other people throughout the world. And that's my answer.
Well, I think that's a really good answer.
Thank you.
No, you're really wonderful to speak to, and your work really speaks volumes to various issues that I think people know about, and some things that people don't even think about. I mean, we live in this country and we don't really, I think, unless you're really connected to it, think about the territories. You're really bringing attention to something that is long overdue, at least in this country.
Yeah.
Right? So I really applaud you for that work. And I have certainly learned a lot in viewing it. And I think that unless you have something you want to add, we can open the floor up to questions.
The only thing I want to add is that, can we go back to Ali, can we go back to the image that shows all of the political side of the quilts? So no, that's a spiritual. Thank you, that one. It was really important for me to be able to talk about each quilt and each territory through the quilts, so that people would be able to access the things that are that the US has done inadequately, I think, in my opinion, for each territory. For example, when it comes to infrastructure, telecommunications, opportunities for youth and for future, and for literally paying your bills. And through the works, for example, Guam, the Guam and Northern Mariana Island quilt. Guam has such a population, a high population or high amount of their population that basically ends up in the armed forces. And that's one of those back and forth, because absolutely patriotism and supporting the rest of the United States in that way is absolutely needed, required from every state to some degree. But the amount of land that the U.S. Armed Forces has taken and to some extent annexed and taken away from indigenous people is problematic. And that has then a trickle effect in relation to how it relates to agriculture and natural-based remedies and or natural aspects of a territory's culture. You know, and then the gradation that you see like in Puerto Rico and in USVI, meaning the colors, the red, orange, yellow, and the expanse, that is referring to environmental racism. And specifically how, I mentioned infrastructure, because natural disasters, whether absolutely is about global warming to some extent and about trash that we use and haven't figured out how to get rid of appropriately to not hurt our earth. But it's also about the resources not being in place to prepare the buildings and structures and infrastructure, you know, water pipes and things like that, either to prepare them for instances of natural disaster and or to repair. And when those things, that funding is not ongoing enough, that is the things that are lasting in a negative way towards the continued growth of the territories. And then that's it.
That's a very important point. Thank you. So let me see, shall we open it up to questions and see if there's anything in the chat? Juanita, do you want to moderate the questions? I don't exactly know how to find them.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I don't know that we have any questions yet, but I want to encourage people to ask. Oh, there's Melvin Hardy raising his hand. So just as a process, do what Mel just did. If you want to ask your questions directly to the speakers, raise your hand, go down to reactions at the bottom of the screen and then choose raise hand. Or if you'd rather ask a question in the chat, do that and we'll address your question through the chat. Okay, let's turn it to Mel. What's your question, Mel?
Please forgive me. I don't want to be long-winded, but I do want to have a couple of reactions. Number one, early in your talk, Miss Amber, and I just want to point to—
Yes, the piece behind you.
Okay.
I haven't seen it in a while.
So just so that I'm wearing a halo. Okay, so early in your talk, you talked about a sense of patriotism.
Yeah.
You just finished with you know, what the people of Guam do in you know, engaging with U.S. forces there. Yeah. There's a constant theme, I think, in your talk today about connective tissue. There's this not only the metaphoric, but the image of the banyan tree as representing diasporic culture and the symbiosis of other things growing with it.
Yes.
Yeah. And then there's the matter of the duality of the big quilts, which have to do with the politics and your own inquiry, mining from within yourself, your better and higher self spiritually. So all of these things kind of resonate with me, not only because I know you somewhat, but also because of what I think you are delivering to those of us who get a chance to witness this work. So question, please forgive me, Wendy, about the long-winded nature of this, but so let me ask you about what might be your vision to knit together an American narrative that heretofore has not been crafted, may not have been intended to have been crafted, but for which you, as a member of the creative class, can help guide us to an understanding of what that narrative could be. Can you speak to that?
Meaning and how I approach the quilts?
Well, it's not about the quilts because you're going to do other work after this.
And I'm sorry, I really mean in how I approach the conversation around the territories. Is that what you mean?
The territories, the quilts, but also in your own personage, your aesthetic vocabulary, I'm asking you to help imagine, guide us in our own imagination about a new American narrative.
Mm-hmm. So, the term people of the greater majority, her name, I want to say it's derived from a conversation that a professor at I cannot remember her name. But it's based on statistics in the sense that, we are literally people of color our numbers are so much greater than people that are of European and white or considered Caucasian. And from my early limited eye, when I would hear about slavery, when I hear about apartheid, when I hear about all of the different trials and tribulations that has happened to people of color, and my limited understanding of geography, okay, I've always wondered, why is it that when there are literally more people of color that I consider of color, why are we still so divided and conquered by people that are not of color? And and maybe that's just my perception of I don't even know if my perception of what, but it's something that has been gnawing at the back of my brain for so long. And I once I realized that this conversation was not just about my individual heritage, and that it was an absolute, micro and macro conversation. I that's what made me basically say, I have to put some of this to a creative energy, to a creative manifest, hopefully for a further conversation. I still don't know, beyond politics and control and capitalism. I still don't get it. And it saddens me. And so the way that I deal with things that I'm sad, concerned about, is to create. And so in some sense, I don't have the answers for that question. I literally am doing this from my own personal, as my own personal journey, and building up the layers of who I am as Amber Robles-Gordon. But also in that journey, there is a humanitarian thread in relationship to how I think, how I process information, and then how I project it through with my artwork. And I'm hoping that there's many more of me that are thinking this way and that are able to see that through the work. And I'm willing to have further conversations. I'm willing to contribute as much as I possibly can, but I know it's not about only the things that I'm thinking of. But I absolutely hope that this is part of that catalyst to initiate more conversations, to further that conversation about people of the global majority, and because we need to take back our power.
Stay blessed, my dear.
Thank you. And it's really good to see that work.
Thank you, Mel. Do we have, and Amber, I've loved your answer, an answer from the heart. Do we have other questions? Oh, so I hear, I have a question from somebody, that Mac owner, I'm not sure who. Would you ask the artist what she would have done vis-a-vis Rauschenberg if the pandemic, oh, this is from Leonade. Hi, Leonade. What she would have done vis-a-vis Rauschenberg if the pandemic had not happened? If the pandemic had not happened.
Yeah, so he did a series called the Bed series, where he was working with materials that were secondhand materials and or recycled materials. And he literally took apart a series of pillows and quilts and painted on them. I wanted to, and then there was these, I forgot the other, it was the Bed series and then something else. And it was these series that had dividing panels, those things that you can connect and they can divide a space. He took apart and painted and repurposed and assemblaged them. And if you know anything about my work, I absolutely love working big, and I love working in installations and sculptural. So I wanted just the freedom, and the space and time to just go abstract. And I thought this was going to be my show to do that, but it just didn't happen. But I would absolutely, I envision a space where I would be a little bit more intentionally sculptural, and I would just go wild in relationship to abstraction, and I most likely would absolutely use no figuration at all and just be a-okay with it. But beyond that, I can't tell you what it would be. I don't know yet. Hopefully that will come soon.
Okay, so we have a question from Juanita and or Neil Hartbarger. And they're asking about the pictures, the images on the wall behind you. What are they and why were they chosen for that wall?
Okay, so this wall to the right of me are just prints, like literally thrift store prints. I've always been attracted to what I would consider Asian inspired art. And then above that is a portrait that I did many moons ago. And then this one is, it's actually, I did this while in Michael Platt's class in one of his digital classes. And it was after a series of me going back home to St. Thomas and spending some time with my grandmother. And so it's layering of images of various taken throughout St. Thomas, overlaid over my grandmother. And my grandmother and I were getting ready to go to the beach, and she allowed me to take photos of her. She probably knocked me in the head if she saw that image on screen, but shh, don't tell her.
Okay, let me see if we have other questions in the chat. No, I have a question. This is actually a question for Tuliza. So Tuliza, when we asked you to have this conversation with Amber, I remember you saying, well, I need to know more about her and her work, blah, 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 and dot, 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 and so forth and so on. And she actually came to the gallery, to the museum, and saw you, joined one of your tours and talks. And it struck me as I'm listening to your questions, Tuliza, that you went pretty deep.
Yes.
Like you know a lot about her now. And I just wonder if there were any impressions or thoughts you wanted to share that go beyond the conversation the two of you just had that stood out for you.
Well, I think that, and thank you for that. And I did learn so much about you. Thank God for that tour, Amber. I really, really enjoyed it. I learned so much. You give a great tour, and the way that you talk about your art is so complex and intellectual and interesting. And I am just so pleased that Juanita asked me to do this program. And I think that one of the things that stood out to me was the quilts in general. And it was the fact that you use them, the back and the front, which as a curator, I'm like, well, how do you display that in a small space? It was two side by side, but they really are quite beautiful. And I think it was a really interesting choice for you to do that in terms of, I suppose, a curator's eye. I love it. I love it. I love it. And
thank you.
I thought it was really, really wonderful works. And I think it stood out to me, probably the DC piece the most. That piece, I think, talks about the disenfranchisement of people in the capital city of this country, and the fact that African Americans built this city, and the White House and laid out the city the way it's laid out. And I think that bringing those points to bear while simultaneously talking about disenfranchisement and what that means in the city was really quite interesting. And I think that's probably the piece that stood out to me the most.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Well, I think we're coming up on our time. Unless there are other questions, did I miss anybody? Any questions? Okay, well, again, this has been a wonderful conversation. And as we all looked forward to it in anticipation, you guys just exceeded our expectations in that regard. Can everybody on the line, if you want to unmute or not, just let's give them a hand. Let's let them know how much we appreciate them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much.
Wonderful.
And so, Melvin?
Yeah, it looks like I can't turn my camera on now, Ali, but that's okay. Asked me to start the video. Okay, Ali, thank you. Anyways, this is my opportunity to give thanks to everyone who was associated with this project. The Katzen Arts Center at American University has done just a fabulous job in both hosting the exhibition, but also allowing us at Millennium Arts Salon to engage with them, the museum, to deliver this salon talk and the kind of programming that we think is important to bring to not only our audience, but to the wider community. What I think we've heard today was a creative soul providing a sense of history, a sense of the contemporary life in which we all find ourselves, and a vision for our future. So we want to thank the Katzen Arts Center for being a repository for that. Then there's so many other people, the staff at the Katzen, that kind of thing. So we thank you, Ali and Chelsea and Jack. Then there's our board of directors who really provide the support and energy for us to deliver Millennium Arts Salon. So we thank each and every one of you. None of this can happen without your support. And amongst the major thanks go to the participants in a program like this. First of all, you've come, you're here, and we embrace each and every one of you. We thank you for being members. For those of you who are not yet, please join us in membership. We're just coming out of a COVID year, 2 years actually. We're starting programs again, and we will have significant opportunities going forward. We have a major piece of our own Millennium Arts Salon life over 22 years that we're trying to support, which is the archives. We want to talk more about that going forward. But we want to give thanks to each and every one of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all. Thank you for your attendance here today. And please allow us to look forward to being in your presence again, both virtually and when we can, face to face. So thanks again. And
I want to say thank you to Juanita and Mel, and thank you, Tuliza, for agreeing to have this conversation. I really appreciate the energy that you guys have brought to this this conversation and just the planning in general. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amber and Tuliza. And to let everybody know that we will have a recording available that we will send out to folks, because we know that some people might not have been able to connect in, but there will be a video, so you'll be able to see and hear these two dynamic women again. So we're so appreciative. Have a good Saturday afternoon, everyone. All right, we'll see you all. Take care.